successfully into the podium. I will. Very good. Colleagues, thank you very much for coming back to the second session of our day. Very exciting session. I also welcome colleagues who are joining us from online. Happy to have you virtually with us. Our second session is really an important session, and it has, during the first session, countries has already started discussing some of the topics that we will have now, because the needs are there, and we need to see where to go and fetch for those funds. All of us, we know that national budgets will not be enough. We need to look somewhere else. We need to increase efficiency. We need to tap into innovative resources. And this is basically what we are going to discuss in this session. And I'm very grateful to our colleagues from CDP, Dutch initiative, Valuing Water Initiative, and also OECD to come together and convene this session. And I would like to invite our esteemed facilitator and who will be not facilitated by our esteemed Nicolette Bartlett, who will be providing an introduction to this important session. Nicolette is the Chief Impact Officer at CDP, managing the thought leadership, disclosure, content, policy, strategy, and fundraising teams at CDP. Nicolette previously had the position of Carbon Director and Global Director of Climate Change at CDP and has been the lead author of many CDP publications. She is a board member of the Science Based Targets Initiatives, currently represents CDP on the We Mean Business board, is a member of the technical advisory boards of the VMCI and NZDBU, not easy acronym, and is a senior associate of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Before joining CDP, Nicolette was a senior program manager at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, leading on international climate policy projects, including the international engagement of the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group, developing a green growth platform in Pacific Alliance countries, supporting the development of business groups on climate change and research, analyzing the role that non-state actors play in driving down emissions. Areas of focus of Nicolette: ESG data, corporate reporting, sustainable finance, mandatory environment disclosure frameworks and standards, nature, water, climate transition plans, cities, states, and regions, and name others. Nicolette, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Gosh, I need to cut that biography down. Didn't even know it was in there. It's a great pleasure to be here today. CDP, this conversation has been a long time coming, I think, in the mainstream here in climate, in the COP, but also in the water discussions, right? How we actually start to bring the water world and the finance world together, because that's literally what CDP does, and it's been a long journey to get to a place where you're starting to see those worlds merge. You're starting to see this become a boardroom issue. You're starting to see this become an issue for banks worried about the water stress in their portfolios. CDP has been running a water program for 12 years. So we work on behalf of institutional investors and big buyers who seek to drive things through their value chain, supply chains, and across their portfolios. We have 130 trillion in assets represented through those institutional investors. So investors are around 700, and the big buyers, it's about 6.5 trillion in annual purchasing power. And we found those to be very powerful drivers for change. And water is one of those areas. We're at a stage now where we have over 5,000 companies disclosing through CDP across their water security commodity issues. So we've got 23,000 on climate, 5,000 on water. We don't ask all companies to disclose on water because it depends on where they're based and what sectors they're in. But it works. When the finance sector engages with them, when we're out there gaining transparency and data from them, consistently in the last decade, we've been tracking a group of companies that have been consistently reporting, and their water withdrawals have reduced quite significantly. And that is because disclosure works, transparency works, and also the finance sector's leverage in the space is really, really powerful. I just want to highlight one key statistic that came out in the last week. The Global Resilience Partnership Commission and BCG did a report based on our data. And they were pulling from all the data sets, looking to see what they could see when it comes to investment in initiatives around resilience. Was there a benefit to cost ratio? You know, did companies get a payback? Was there actually a real efficiency in doing so? And some of these measures that they tracked were very much linked to water security. And so what they found was for every $1 invested in adaptation and resilience measures, it yielded $2 to $5 in finance. So the benefit to cost ratio, 2 to 15. So the benefit to cost ratio is 2 to 1 to 15 to 1 for these measures. And many of them have a big impact on the hydrological cycle. So there is already a nascent, it's always been a narrative that investing in adaptation, investing in these measures, does not have a financial benefit. That is absolutely not true. The opposite is in fact true. And that is what we're here to discuss, how we bring that to the fore, how we have the economics and the finance sector lean into this. So we're going to have a really great panel now of 3 different speakers. And we're examining the water, finance, climate nexus. We're at the COP, right? We're talking about finance, and we're talking about climate, and we're talking about how that interacts with the water, because it's often forgotten. You will have been walking around and seeing loads of things on AI saving the world, I'm sure, and technologies. Just that on its own, I've been looking this morning, causes an extraordinary amount of water to be used. And in the next 2 or 3 years, that number's just going to compound. So we are in a space now where we need to start looking at the energy nexus and the water nexus together, or we will have some serious water shortages. Let me introduce our first speaker. So Nayoko Ishii, she's the Executive Vice President Director of the Center for Global Commons at the University of Tokyo and the Commissioner of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. And I think your discussion today will be perfectly on this very topic, which is around mainstreaming water in finance. So really looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolette, for the very kind introduction. Very happy to be here on this very important topic. Actually, I'm representing maybe this report, the Global Commission of the Economics of Water. That's the point, economics of the water, and how economics can really leverage this water issue into the finance issue, also in relation to the climate. So that's something I really would like to discuss. And maybe actually our commission, Global Commission on the Economics of the Water, has been working already more than 1 year, and we just published the report last March, and we'll be actually finalizing the final report coming this year. But our starting point is actually science, planetary science or Earth system science. How many of you in this audience know the concept of planetary boundaries? Raise your hand. Okay, most of you. Good. So that maybe many of you know already there are 9 boundaries, and the 6 out of 9 we have already transgressed. And the water is considered to be safe area until recently, but the latest science told us that we have also transgressed water boundary, and they also made sure that the green water and blue water. And the important point is that this green water is actually the global common good. It's not a local common issue, it's a global common issue. Why is that? the hydrological cycle actually compounds the climate change, and the moisture is a condition for soil and vegetation to capture and store the carbon. And if this green water or moisture actually exceeded these planetary boundaries, it has a significant impact on the climate change and the significant impacts on the health of the planet and the health of our civilization, if I may say. So this is a new discovery of planetary boundaries, planetary science, that green water is a global common good, and we have already transgressed this planetary boundary. It's a new discovery from the science. Then the economists like us really try to figure out what does it mean in terms of economics and the financial sector. That's the starting point of this report. So that is why this report looks still a little different from traditional conventional water report, because we try to really figure out how the economic sector, financial sector can capture and digest this message and translate into the new way of approaching the water sector. So that's the essence. That's actually the task. So from that point of view, the report, still ongoing one because we are finalizing the new one, has two issues. One is a valuation. What kind of price you want to put on the water? So the valuation of the water is one thing. But the second thing is governance issue. So how the valuation of the water and also the governance may need to change based on this new economic finding. So this is two things I want to talk a little bit today. So in terms of the valuation, I know many of you have been working on that, and then Nicolette already told us that how much the new the BCG report tell us. So actually there are a lot of numbers, and there are a growing recognition that water is a material risk to finance, material risk to economy, and material risk to our well-being. So no doubt about it. The challenge is that how you can really figure out that the fit of the value chain in what way on how much is kind of, at risk. TCFD, TNFD, ISSB, CDP have been doing a lot of good work, and so that a lot of data, that a lot of method, the approach has been already on place. But in terms of financial sector, maybe one of the very interesting one is that the NGFS, the network of central banks which are committed to the sustainability issue, is actually the issue that the statement in 2021 that this very much like a climate risk, nature risk has been a significant impact on the stability of the financial system, so that it falls in their mandate, central bank mandate, to take care of and to consider how to handle this nature-related risk. And of course, we all know water is firmly embedded into the nature and the climate. So that's why it's very important for the financial sector to take care of this water as a risk. And that's kind of, that Nicolette said, that how to leverage the influence of the financial system to address this water issue. So that's a starting point. However, I do have a little bit of a challenge to all of you, including maybe also CDP colleague. We are good at trying to understand risk side and try to manage water-related risk. To what extent are we making the progress of investment side, opportunity side, the water as an asset side? That is a huge jump that we need to really figure out. And that is something that the new economic metrics has to figure out. It's not good enough to think about here is a risk-related climate, it's a risk-related water, we can really manage the risk. But in order for the water to receive the financial resources, we also need to figure out what are the investment opportunities, what are the real value of the water as an asset, how you can really put the water as a natural asset on your balance sheet. That is the next step we need to really think. I have to say our report hasn't been really doing that yet, but that is the next stage that we will find out, so that of course that the water account, natural capital account and the water account, that the disclosure, maybe mandatory disclosure, is a very good way to flow the money into the right direction. So it's a great step, but in addition to those great steps, let's think about how we can really figure out the monetary value on the water. So then put the water as an asset on the balance sheet. That is the next step, and we have to really put all our heads together to go for that. Then the money, the investment money will flow into that space much more naturally. Right now, I see a lot of good initiative kind of worked out, but still kind of fragmented all over the world. It doesn't really add up to shift the economics or the metrics of economics. So that is something we all need to find out, and we need to work together to change the economic metrics of the water sector. So I just want to talk a little bit about the governance issue, because the valuation is one thing, the governance is another. And the water, particularly when we try to put the monetary value on the water, not everybody likes it, because water, natural capital, has so many value which cannot be really translated in the money term. At the same time, being also the practitioner for 40 years. Without really doing that, you can't really protect the water. You can't really protect the natural capital. So we have to find some way to put the monetary value on the water. Then the governance structure becomes so important. Let's take the riverways and the catchment and where the many stakeholders come together. Then let's bring those voices together on the table. Then we have to figure out that what is the best value we can put, and what is the decision that community can take. So the local community, indigenous people, the people along the riverside and catchment, and the agriculture use, industrial use, then ecosystem use, because ecosystem needs some certain amount of water to continue to last. So that let's bring those together. Let's make that then fair, transparent, equitable governance system, and that's something we called it the Just Water Partnership in our report. So it's a governance mechanism. Of course, with that, MDB money, development financial corporations money, private sector money, philanthropy money, national government money, all have to come together to create the blended finance. But it's not just the money. It's more like a capability of those financial resources and actually the governing mechanism, the voices of the people. So that is the meaning of Just Water Partnership. And with that, I hope money can really flow into the right position at the right time at the hand of the right people. I have to say one thing, subsidies. Without that, Ngozi will kill me. The Ngozi, that the head of the WTO, really keen to make sure that we also address that the adverse the subsidy, which is right now $400 billion US per year in agriculture sector, and which is working against us, against water. And unless we remove it and to make sure that the financial flow into the right place, we will not really win this battle. So that's maybe last important point I just have to put on the table. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm very excited to see that work commence on the asset valuation of water. I think that will be very, very, very powerful. So, my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. So this is Mr. Alex Sambalabwe. He is the Executive Secretary of the Global Water Partnership of Southern Africa. And you're here today to discuss the outcome of the Africa Water Investment Programme, Financing Sources Pyramid. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to be speaking a couple of times today, so I don't know how many times I will be introduced. But I do understand that people are coming in and going, and we also have a fantastic online presence. Yeah, so I think, I'm going to spend about 5 to 7 minutes to talk about the financing sources. And I think it's a very great segue into what our previous speaker has been talking about. Particularly, I'm excited about the issue of water as an investment asset class, because that is very, very key to unlock billions of finance for water. We talk about millions, but billions. So let's go to the pyramid. If you can just put a slide. So the pyramid of investment transformation has emerged out of the work that has been done by the International High-Level Panel on water investments for Africa. I'm not sure if you can see that from the back. But if you can't, I encourage you just move. There's some space. You can come and stand here because I'm going to be talking about something really, really powerful, building on what my colleague has just presented. The work has emerged out of the work of the International High-Level Panel on Water Investments for Africa. Now, what is this panel? At the World Water Forum, the President of Senegal, President Macky Sall, at the closing ceremony came and said, look, we've been talking a lot for a long time and always we talk about problems. Money, 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 we need to find the money. So he said, I'm going to launch a panel of heads of states, sitting heads of states with global leaders to try and help us find the money for water investments on the continent in Africa. Because everyone says Africa challenges of access to water, 400 million people don't have water, good water, access to clean water, sanitation, all these big numbers, and they're very depressing. Very depressing because the solutions are there, the technology is there, but we need to find the money. So he launched this panel comprising a couple of heads of states with President Macky Sall as the co-chair, Prime Minister Mark Rutte of the Netherlands, as my colleagues from the Netherlands are here, as the co-chair, together with the presidents of Namibia and the former president of Tanzania, Jakaya Kikwete, who is also the chair of Global Water for South Africa. So the panel set out to do their work, and then at the UN Water Conference released their first report, really about finding at least an estimated 30 billion, which is estimated to be the amount of funding required to make progress, significant progress on the SDG water targets in Africa. So the pyramid shows the potential financing sources. 9 sources were identified, and over 40 experts working together, including some of the finest brains in economics and finance and water. Some of them I met them for the first time. Institutional investors, private sector. You don't see them in the world meetings of World Water Forum or World Water Week or the normal meeting we organize. But they were organized and invited by the high-level panel to do this work. So they identified 9 potential sources. There's more, but they identified potentially 9 that are critical for water. So the first one, which is very, very key, is I think we have at the very bottom. I don't see the foundation one. Oh yes, go down further. Yes, down, 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 because this is very foundational. This is key. So they identified that look, we can potentially leverage $11.5 billion into the water sector from existing resources already. Before you even bring in new money, you can already leverage an additional 11.5 billion from existing financial flows going into the sector by addressing one thing: efficiency and governance. Because there are huge efficiency losses in the sector, and in most African countries, over 60% of water that has been treated, pumped at very high costs, and also caused a few emissions, it goes into the ground because of leakages unaccounted for water. So improving efficiencies to ensure that you reduce the amount of wastage is very, very key. Increasing efficiency in agriculture, because agriculture uses about 70% of water in irrigation. Most of it gets lost into evaporation, not efficiently utilized. Increasing efficiency as well, including increasing energy efficiency, because one of the biggest costs of utilities, water companies that supply water, is labor, energy, as one of the key areas. So improving on energy efficiency as well would be one of the key areas that you can try and reduce the amount of funding that is being wasted, but also improving overall governance. And here we are talking about good water governance that makes sense. Avoiding duplication, fragmentation, the things that we already know. Because water is in the Ministry of Health, water is in the Ministry of Agriculture, irrigation, in energy, it's all over the place. And as a result, you've got so many inefficiencies in the system. And this is not under Africa, but it's the case even in many cases. Even when you go to financing institutions, multilateral development banks, you find water spread in many, many areas. So there's a huge inefficiencies in the whole system that can be optimized by just simply better water governance. So according to a panel report, about 100 billion, what you have on what you have here on your left, depending on where you're seated online, what you have on your left here is the potential funding that is available that could potentially be leveraged. So it's about $100 billion on existing assets until 2030, and the potential an additional 50 billion on new investments through improvements in technologies. That's if you adopt technology incentive technologies, water-saving measures to ensure that you have got all these innovative things that we already know and we see them and we use them even here, wherever we go to try and see in terms of these technologies that when they are being installed. So you have potentially 100 billion improving efficiencies on the existing systems and an additional in new investments by adopting new technology. But we know that it's too ambitious and very unrealistic to expect that you can achieve these numbers just like that, because you cannot have 100% efficiency. It's not going to happen. So the high-level panel says, okay, let's be very realistic and be very conservative. If countries and governments, utilities, adopt a target of improving efficiency on existing assets by 10%, now 10% is very small. I mean, if you're in school, you failed terribly. If you increase your efficiency only by 10% on existing assets, we could potentially generate an additional 1.5 billion through savings. This is just common sense, making good of what you already have. And if you adopt new technologies as well, for new technologies, the technologies are there, and if these technologies are actually accessible through South-South cooperation, and most of them are anyway, an additional 10 billion could be mobilized, because this is new technologies that you're putting in irrigation systems as well as in public buildings. Combined, up to 11.5 billion could be leveraged. So we're talking a green climate fund just got a replenishment of 12.8 billion, and we are all very happy. But just by not even going to the GCF, but doing the things that matter, demand management, behavior change, we already have an additional 11.5 billion. This is just for Africa. The second pillar, which is significant, and this is what also my colleagues have been talking about, is valuing water-related risks better and incorporating the water risk in the balance sheets of companies. So through data that was provided by our partners, CDP, about 9 companies, multinational companies operating in Africa, report an estimated $60 to $67 billion of potential impacts to their operations because of their water risks. About over $60 billion potential impacts to their operations on the balance sheets. Now, typically, a lot of these companies, they try to address these risks by asking the national government to provide the services to ensure that water supply is made available, the assurance of supply. And we said, look, through the work of the high level, through the work of the high level panel, instead of these companies externalizing this cost for mitigating and ensuring water availability, what if we ask the other question? We turn this around, that these companies internalize these costs into their operations, into their balance sheets. Instead of expecting the public utilities, the municipal councils, the governments, the utilities, the national government, the treasury, to provide resources to mitigate, what if these companies actually become better stewards of water by internalizing the costs? That is meaning putting a line in their budget lines, in their operations, just the way they do it for labor. Materials, it's an input. Water is an input into a business. These companies are generating revenue out of using water. So instead of externalizing the costs, they become water stewards by making sure that they internalize water within their balance sheets, but they also make sure that they become water stewards. If they pollute, for instance, there should be incentives for better stewardship and penalties for not doing a good job. If you pollute the environment, it should not be the National Authority for Water Quality Management that should come and pay the price of cleaning up. So significant amounts can be saved as well. There is no amount yet indicated there because the work is still ongoing to actually quantify, and I think my colleague from CTB mentioned that this work is ongoing through companies that are actually disclosing. These are companies that are doing voluntary disclosures. But significant amounts could be generated by industries through better stewardship. Now, the more interesting part, which I'm very, very close to me, which we have not been tapping into, is the third layer. From domestic resource mobilization, domestic resource mobilization could mobilize up to about 17.5 billion, starting with the biggest, institutional investors. Now, globally, $14 trillion is available, and 700 billion under assets management for Africa that could be potentially be tapped. $14 trillion. I mean, that's a whole lot of, these are big numbers. Now, a lot of these institutional investors don't invest in water because of what my colleague talked about earlier. The issue of water as an investment asset class. The economics and the metrics needs to be worked out to ensure that institutional investors are able to allocate some of their resources towards water. They do it for renewable energy. They do it for real estate, hospitality, not for water because of perceived risks, poor tariff system, and many other challenges, including the fact that it's very difficult to value water as an asset because these are investors. This is institutional investors. This is pension money. Your long-term pension money, if they put in their water without assurance that you'll be able to pay it back, you take them to court. So institutional investors is potentially a huge opportunity that can be leveraged up to about $10 billion. But this will require fundamental reform of the sector, ensuring that the right tariffs, the right regulation to ensure that there is recourse in case the funds are not realized, because otherwise they're not going to put money into it. And some of the insurance and pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, are not by law allowed to invest in water. So that has to change. Why are they not allowed? Perceived risk. So if that changes, if water, the issue of water as an investment asset class goes further, is actually quantified, it opens up a whole lot of opportunities. And this is why we are quite excited with the work that is ongoing. Green Climate Fund is pushing this idea of water as an investment asset class, and also the Global Commission on the Economics of Water is also advancing on that. So this is the conversation that is going, and I think it's a huge potential source. Now, I'm going to rush through because now the other financing sources are pretty common. We know about them. African governments, about 6 billion, for instance, already is provided. Actually, we discovered, African governments provide the biggest funding from their treasury towards water and sanitation in Africa. Not donors, African governments. About 60% of the revenue, the financing to water comes from governments. But it's not enough, and they can do more. And the ministers across Africa have said, look, through the consultation of the high-level panel, they could potentially increase this by even 20%, which would increase the amount of funding that is accessible to about 2 billion a year. However, Minister of Finance, and I'll quote one of the Minister of Finance from Uganda, they said, look, we can increase this, but you deal with your losses first, because you are returning money to the treasury every year, not spending it, and most of it is being wasted. So you have to justify that if we increase, you'll be able to spend this. So the money is there. It's about, again, the bottom of the pyramid. If we go further up, potential funding sources in the pyramid from national banks. If you go further up on the pyramid, okay. So potential funding from national banks, pension funds. I want to zero in on 2 areas, climate finance and ODA, as I conclude. Now, if you look at amount of funding climate, and this is a huge estimate and an assumption, potentially $2.2 trillion from NDCs. This is the amount of money NDCs quantify for Africa that they're saying they would want to be made available. If you look at the NDCs to the UNFCCC, globally it's more. It's again in trillions. And the assumption is that 100 billion is provided for. We know it's not going to be provided for. So far, we have missed that target. And if you have an equal allocation of 50% adaptation, 50% water mitigation, and out of the adaptation, you take a reasonable amount of conservative figure of 30% towards water, you could potentially get up to 3.2 billion. But we know this number is optimistic, because it's not like that. That money is actually not there. So even at the most optimistic level, assuming the 100 billion per year target would have been achieved, you can see the level of how much you will be able to generate from climate finance. Compared to the domestic finance, it's very tiny. The narrative and the message here is that we have money in domestic. The biggest opportunity is domestic finance. Climate finance is additional. It's not a bigger source of money. We need it, yes, to clean up some of the damages and the costs, but it's not the largest. And the most critical message for me is when you look at ODA, 0.5. It's not deliberate or by design. ODA is the smallest. Look how much it is. It's so small. But this is where we often try to tap into when we go for water services, water grants, and all that. But it's a very tiny amount of money, and it's just going to go down and down because we know where the money now is going with all the challenges that are going on, conflicts here and there. So it's very tiny. The core message here is improve efficiencies, huge opportunities for domestic resource mobilization. Focus on that. And of course, the other monies can be additional. We still need it, but it's very, very tiny. So these are the financing sources. The report is available online. There's also now the investment plan that has been developed to say, okay, fine, you get this money, where does it go? So 53 investment projects have been identified as investment opportunities where the funding could potentially go. So we're very grateful to our partners who have been working with on their high-level panel, our heads of states, and of course, the Netherlands have also been very, very key. I'm going to conclude here. I've taken slightly more than 7 minutes, as I promised, but I hope it's been worthwhile. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Alex. Hello, everybody. I'm not Nicolette from CDP, I'm afraid. She had to be somewhere else. I will be picking up the moderation for the rest of this segment, and then we will be going into a panel discussion. So I'm Joe Ray. I'm a senior advisor with a Dutch government program called the Valuing Water Initiative. It'll be familiar to many of you, but perhaps not all. It gives me very great pleasure to introduce our third keynote speaker. Sarine Malik is Executive Secretary of the African Civil Society Network on Water. She is also the Vice Chair of Sanitation and Water for All. Sarine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. So I'm going to try and keep this within 5 minutes. Now, while I absolutely enjoy turning words into art, I will refrain from doing so over here because our colleagues from OECD prepared a wonderful outcome document on the meeting that we had in Abidjan on the 22nd and the 23rd. Now, my brother Alex, I feel, has, yes, gone into extent in terms of what the financial landscape or the financing landscape on the continent looks like. However, just a couple of key messages that came out of that meeting. So I will go ahead and so we all know that countries are interconnected through the water cycle. Action is needed that is bolder, more integrated across sectors, and more networked at national, regional, and global levels. Something that came up a lot was the market failure thinking needs to change. We cannot just count on public and development finance, and I think this is what Alex actually alluded to in terms of who are the other players that will have to be brought in. And there's a need to take a market-shaping approach for the water sector. A sustainable and just water future can be achieved, and it requires transforming the economics and restructuring the governance of water. And here again, we come back to the issue of the governance of water. Micah yesterday mentioned, she put it so eloquently when she said that water is the engine of climate change action. But we've just seen from the presentation of the Africa Investment Program, this engine costs a lot to develop, to maintain, to look after, because this would be the main system. And the key issue is, yes, climate crisis is a water crisis is a governance crisis. So these are really something, again, we will drive the point home in terms of improving the governance of the water sector. Next, other ideas that came up. So of course, the need to invest, to mobilize investment towards water security, but also the need to mainstream understanding of water risks and opportunities across investments to drive systemic change. And one key point is that we also need to make sure that policymakers, financial supervisors, and financial institutions are thinking about the impacts and dependencies on the investment of water. All too often, particularly in the private sector, we find that the economies are dependent on water. The private sector sometimes tends to overlook. Now, I know the Water Stewardship Program, CDP, really tries to raise awareness on that fact. They think they can just go ahead and extract all you want, and then when it runs out to fill that bottle of soda, it becomes a bit of an issue. So it is really critical that they be in alignment. We cannot ignore the financial systems on the dependency of water. And in particular, when it comes to climate change action, we know that climate-related risks have implications for financial stability. And in 2021, the NGFs issued a statement that very much like climate-related risks, nature-related risks can have implications for financial stability. We talked about yesterday about political stability, which of course then would have an impact as well on the issues of financial stability. Both climate and nature need to be considered by central banks in the fulfillment of their mandates, and water is a critical pillar in both climate and nature discussions. And finally, mainstreaming water in finance requires actions across different actors to assess and manage water-related risks and opportunities. We need finance and the power of markets to be harnessed to support a water-secure global economy that accounts for the water impact of its activities. There's also the importance of taking an integrated approach to addressing water challenges. So that is a bit in summary what came out of that particular meeting. But what really came out again was the people don't like using the C word, corruption. That did come out in that meeting quite a bit. Alex just explained over here that, yes, the leakages, we have all this water getting lost, going back into the ground. Actually, that's only 25% of it. 75% goes into pockets. You should look up the brown envelope theory. So that is something in terms of, again, we need to improve our governance systems. We need to improve the governance sector, the governance of the water sector, in order to create an enabling environment for climate change, including in terms of financing, and of course, working towards a water secure future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarine. Thank you to all of our keynote speakers for inspiring us and for setting up the discussion so nicely. So I mentioned very briefly, I work for a Dutch government program called the Valuing Water Initiative. I just want to give a very little bit of background on that, because I think it's relevant for the discussion that we're about to have. So VWI was set up in 2019 as a response to the United Nations World Bank High-Level Panel on Water. Again, it'll be familiar to many of you, but perhaps not all. And it called for water to be prioritized in decision-making and for its many values to be better taken into account. And some of our speakers this morning have already alluded to the fact that water is too often undervalued, underappreciated in decision-making processes across different geographies and sectors. And what we need is system change in that context. So VWI was set up in 2019. We were given our marching orders by the high-level panel. And since that time, we've been working with partners around the world, many of them here today, to try to drive better decisions impacting water across a wide variety of sectors. We have a particular focus on those sectors where water has not traditionally been a priority, in sectors where water has perhaps just been taken for granted in terms of quality, quantity, availability, and access. And our starting point is that many of the decisions which have an impact on water, and of course climate as well, are not in fact made by water and climate professionals, if only that were the case. And we believe, in our theory of change, that many of the most impactful decisions are actually made in the corporate space. And ultimately, if you go all the way upstream, by the financial sector, which enables and incentivizes our economic activity. So, like many of you, I've been here at COP since Finance Day, 4th of December, a long time ago now. It strikes me there are at least 2 finance discussions going on in parallel. On the one hand, we have the sources of finance conversation, where we're discussing how best to fund the projects that so desperately need funding, and often that takes the form of blended finance, so by blending together public or philanthropic with private money to lower the risk for private investors. Of course, there are many different ways of doing that, but the blended finance discussion, as I'm sure you've all seen, has been getting a lot of attention this week. I want to give some credit here to WWF. Their sustainable finance lead, Aaron Vermeulen, couldn't be here for this panel, but I am going to borrow some of his terminology. So WWF referred to this finance conversation as financing green. Now, at the same time, there's a second conversation going on. I would argue more or less in parallel, at least from my experience here at COP this week, to the first conversation, but again, no less important. I want to borrow from WWF again here and call this agenda greening finance. Financing green, greening finance. And here we're talking about capital allocation decisions that are being made by pension fund managers who control shares in multinational companies with the largest water footprints. We're talking about credit rating agencies, who we have in the room with us today, whose assessment of a company's exposure to water and climate risk determines the rates at which those companies can borrow. And by the commercial banks who can choose whether or not to engage with their corporate clients on steering them towards more water and climate resilient practices. So even here at COP, and although we've had a finance day within the COP presidency theme, and here, of course, we are at the Water Pavilion on Transformative Climate Finance Day, these conversations, I feel, are rarely joined up. So one of the highlights of today's program, in my view at least, is that we're actually looking at both sides of this discussion, and that's been reflected in our keynote speeches that we've had, and we will get into the discussions on that further. So final concluding point from me is that this is not a case of either or. This is not about either financing green or greening finance. We need both. And the scale of the challenge that we're facing when it comes to water and climate resilience is profound and requires action on all fronts and for all of us to join forces from our various different strengths and vantage points. So my conclusion is that we need to finance change, but that means we also need to change finance. And I'm pleased that we're able to address this collectively today. So on that note, I'm very pleased to introduce Patricia Calderon, who is Associate Director of Water Security at CDP, and who'll be speaking to the role that disclosure plays as one of the important pieces to this puzzle. So Patricia, over to you.
May I have my slides, please? Great, thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you to our previous speakers. It's an honor to be here. I'll be discussing the importance of mandatory disclosure and private sector involvement, and particularly climate, water, energy nexus. Oops. Just trying to get around it. So in my agenda, first I'll introduce CDP's mission. I will also cover how water risks are already materializing in corporations and how this is affecting financial institutions, how data is actually helping our investors and others to inform their decisions. I will introduce some of the results from the financial sector water disclosures for 2023. And then how we're going to be scaling up these solutions. What are the plans of CDP going forward? First, you may not be familiar with CDP. For those that are not, we're a non-profit organization. Our mission is to engage with civil society, with everybody, to ensure a water secure future for the long term. And the way we work, and in this diagram, it's essentially we, on behalf of investor signatories, it is about 700, we got about 746 signatories, purchasing organizations, 330, and cities, states, and regions. We actually request their stakeholders, in particular listed companies, suppliers, and local governments. We call them disclosures. We request information from them on environmental performance. And we do this by questionnaires. We cover climate change, water security, and forests, as Nicolette mentioned before. She mentioned some of the high-level statistics on the number of responders, and particularly for climate change, about 23,000. Since 2018, the questionnaires have been TCFD aligned, so aligned with the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures. And from 2024, we're going to be aligned with the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures. So what does that mean? Since 2018, we're focusing on the materiality of water to the business. From 2024, it's about double materiality, the impact. So not only the impact of water on the business, but then what about the business on the environment? We collect this data, and then we feed it back to the requesting organizations as well as civil society, academia, the stock indices, as Nicolette mentioned before. This data is essential for informing investment, for assessing risks, and for managing these. This is the Po Rio Basin. This is in Italy during last year's drought, and what is shown here is the importance of river basin water risks. This affected the low water in there, affected shipping, commercial shipping, drinking water, crops, hydropower. And as you may already be aware, the World Water Fund found that the value of freshwater and freshwater ecosystems is about $58 trillion, which is the equivalent of 60% of global GDP. And why am I talking about river basin water risks? Is because in our latest data, we found that over 1,800 organizations reported about 5,000 of their facilities are being exposed to these water risks. They are in 217 river basins, and those countries that are particularly affected are China, Mexico, Japan, and India. Out of those disclosing to us, 229 companies state that the river basins are actually threatening 80% of the company's total global revenue. And there's an example here from Bormoli Luigi, if I pronounce it correctly. This is an Italian glass manufacturer who has indicated to us that their two sites can be affected by extreme water events that could impact the revenue. And this is a report that we produced in 2022, just so showing you, this is the high-level stats, and this is just showing you like tangible on the ground. It's called High and Dry, How Water Issues Are Stranded Assets. And we identified 4 case studies in 4 major infrastructure projects that are in the energy and mining sector, which are critical for the net zero ambition. We found that 13.5 billion assets are stranded and 2 billion are at risk. And had these companies were expected to have revenue, but due to physical water risks, water scarcity, water pollution, that led to reputational risks, so community opposition, which eventually also led to regulatory risks, so the changes in regulations. An example is the Pascua-Lama gold mine. That's between the border of Chile and Argentina. They have 7.5 billion assets stranded. And in particular, they have knock-on effects like cleanup liability, shareholder class action, as well as the inability to fulfill the customers. And this is, I think Nicolette sort of mentioned quite briefly, but it's essentially our latest stats on the water energy nexus. We have 575 financial institutions that disclose to us on climate change, and they are reporting that they're holding about $9 trillion in fossil fuel financing through their portfolios. So that's a significant number. And that's the equivalent of the GDP, of the combined GDP of Japan and Germany. And so we are calling for, in CDP, in this conference, and we're calling for the phasing out of fossil fuels, and for financial institutions, or encouraging financial institutions to do so. Importantly, we also have those companies that we requested companies to disclose on water, and we only had a 28% response rate for this sector involving energy and mining. So this just shows you the contrast of the investment that goes into our fossil fuels and the disclosures of that we're getting on water. So it's quite low, and so we call for investors to request increased transparency on water from these companies in the energy and mining sector in particular. This is the latest figures on the risks. We found that the cost of inaction could be over 5 times the cost of action. The cost of action, money already being invested by companies, 922 companies, is about 100 billion, while the potential impacts that those companies have identified, it's about 531 billion from water risks. So this I just covered the risks, and now I would like to cover the opportunities, the resilience aspects of it. So we found this year that almost 5,000 companies disclosed on water, and that's about 23% increase from last year, and about 90% over the last 10 years. And for the following years, we're aiming to increase even more and more and more, because we're talking about, in climate, we've got 23,000. We're talking about implementing this at scale in thousands and thousands more over the next few years to solve this crisis. And as Nicolette mentioned briefly, this is we have about 120 companies that have consistently disclosed to CDP over the last 9 years. And this is about how they're reducing the water withdrawals. And the water saved is equivalent to 10 times the size of Loch Ness Lake in Scotland. Companies have also indicated to us that they are reducing their water withdrawal, that setting targets to reduce their water withdrawals. About 30% of them indicating that they're doing so. However, if we are to meet SDG 6, we have 9% of companies that are indicating they're setting water sanitation and hygiene targets. So it's a long way to go. More, we have opportunities. About 50% of the companies that disclose are finding opportunities. And as you can see, the traditional fields, the traditional areas, efficiencies, they're disclosing the most. And then the I would say the transformational ones, those that are finding products and services that are low water impact, so that they're not using water or reducing water in the first place, as well as resilience. Next, resilience is about investing on their supply chains and the other one is looking into opportunities in emerging markets, so diversifying. The companies that disclose to us on value of these opportunities indicated there's about 242 billion on opportunities. And moving on to the disclosures from financial institutions themselves, as I indicated, we've been running the corporate water disclosure, corporate water reporting from companies for over 10 years. But thanks to the Valuing Water initiative, we created, and other partners, the Water Footprint Implementation and Water Footprint Network and Mercer, we created the first ever financial sector water questionnaire. So we're asking financial institutions themselves, what are they doing on water? The first results came earlier this year, and I'm going to be going through some of the latest fresh results that my team has worked through. The questionnaire is TCFD aligned, and from next year is going to be into double materiality TNFD aligned. The modules, we cover governance, so obviously board level oversight. We want to go from the top, what companies are doing in terms of oversight and management of water-related issues. Then into risk and opportunities. Are they assessing risk? Are they finding opportunities? Are they putting a value on those? Then business strategy. What are they thinking about long term? Are they doing a scenario analysis, setting targets? Are they creating, or they have existing products and services that served to mitigate water insecurity? Are they doing shareholder voting? And also policy engagement and engagement with their client and investees. And this is some fresh results. We have 300 financial institutions that disclose on water, an increase from last year of 27%. And you can see the coverage across continents and portfolios. We asked more banks to disclose, so we got the most, and followed by asset managers, asset owners, and insurers. And you can see the distribution across regions, particularly quite much more in Europe. Just quickly on some high-level stats of what financial institutions are disclosed to us. 116 financial institutions are looking into their portfolio exposure of water. 148 financial institutions are actually looking into water at board-level oversight. And in terms of driving action, having existing products and services that served to mitigate water insecurity, 94 financial institutions are setting water-related requirements. 124 are engaging in clients and investees, and 118 have existing products and services that enable to to mitigate water insecurity. This is an example. We actually had a roundtable with Joe Ray and my director of capital markets on the 5th of December with banks, and it's an example of what we call it a water footprint loan. It's a sustainability-linked loan. It's the first one on water, and it's the bank BBVA. They launched the first syndicated loan to a value worth about 2.5 billion euros, and they opened this water footprint loan to those companies that are in energy and also water-intensive sectors. And particularly, they have the one company has chosen to go through this, and it's Iberdrola. The indicators, the indicators that are being used is the CDP data, in particular the CDP water score, which covers awareness of water issues, management, as well as it's comprehensive best practice. The other one is reduction on water consumption, and the target that they have is that by 2030 they will have reduced the water consumption by 50%. Every year they will need to report on their progress, and then in that way they get better conditions on their loan. So this is a tangible example of how financial institutions are looking into products and services. And this morning, just quickly, I had a quick look at resilience that my team sent me, and there is quite a few examples of financial institutions, particularly banks, that are creating products particularly for smallholders, and how to transition to resilient crops. There's also products that are enabling mitigating floods and droughts. Okay, time to finish. Scaling up initiatives. So this is so all of this is being enabled, but through what I've shown you here is all of this is being enabled through data. So this data, it's what we use to diagnose. This is what I mentioned to my friends in terms of what I do. Is the data we're being used to diagnose the health of the economy, and in particular, the more companies we have disclosing, the more progress we see. And this is a map of the landscape of mandatory water disclosure. And as you can see, it's quite patchy, with the leading ones being Europe. So what we need more data, better quality data, comparability across jurisdictions. And in particularly for the G20, it's about 40% of them are introducing or in the process of introducing water-related questions. Importantly, from the 1st of January of 2024, the European Union, through the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, will introduce the first ever mandatory water disclosures through the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and that covers water and marine resources, climate change, biodiversity and ecosystems, resource use, and the circular economy. So the landscape is changing, and I will encourage you all to hear from the opportunities also that Joe will be presenting here from CERES about what they're doing on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. It's a very, very important piece to the puzzle, the disclosure piece to all of this. So we've heard a little bit about the role that disclosure can play in driving financial action on water. And I think that statistic on 90% increase in disclosure from companies over the last decade illustrates that companies are understanding this as well. And Patricia, nice also that you shared the example of BBVA, so that's a commercial bank, and how they're using that data to actually drive their clients towards more sustainable water practices. The next question is how do investors and asset managers use this data? And how can those of us in the water and climate community who care about these issues leverage the data to influence corporate behaviour and improve decision-making? So to explain all of this for us, to make it all clear, Kirsten James, Senior Programme Director of Water at Ceres, will be joining us. Kirsten and her team have been leading the Value in Water Finance Initiative. Just like CDP, they've been a long-term partner of VWI, bringing together institutional investors around a set of corporate expectations for value in water. So Kirsten, maybe you could just kick off this next section with a little bit of background to the Value in Water Finance Initiative and the work that you're doing with investors.
Sure, happy to. I'm not sure. Perfect. Wonderful. Okay, all set. Well, thank you so much, Joe, and thanks for having me here today. As Joe mentioned, I'm with an NGO called Ceres. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are based in the United States, and for the past 30 plus years, we've been working with capital market leaders on overcoming a variety of sustainability challenges, including climate change and water resources, the topics at hand today. So as Joe mentioned, we lead in partnership with the government of the Netherlands an initiative called the Value in Water Finance Initiative. And this initiative got its start a few years ago. Ceres has long worked on the issue of water risk, so coming at the capital markets from the perspective of if investors and the private sector that they are owners in are not addressing and mitigating water risk, then that translates to a financial risk for both the company and their investors. So we've done a lot of work over the years in building out the business case of why the private sector needs to engage and do more. But we really came around to the understanding that the scope and scale of the issue is just accelerating at a dizzying pace, as we all know very well. And so how can we really scale the action that we're doing with the capital market system and really scale the change? And so we took a page in the playbook from a lot of the climate work we've been doing, and we concepted the idea of the Value in Water Finance Initiative. And so what this initiative is, it's an investor-led initiative, so a group of institutional investors that are mobilizing companies with a high water footprint to value and act on water as the precious resource that it is. And so we have now 95 institutional investors from around the globe representing over 17 trillion in US dollars assets under management, so quite a significant signatory base. And all of these investors are joining with us to really engage these companies. And so what does that mean, and how does that translate to change on the ground? I think that's an important point. Well, these institutional investors that are pension funds, asset managers, and that are shareholders in these public companies engage with them in a variety of ways via dialogues, communications, shareholder resolutions, annual general meetings. There's a variety of touch points that investors can have to really encourage action from the private sector and encourage them to mitigate their water risk. So that is what we launched about a year ago in partnership with the government of the Netherlands, and happy to talk in a bit about some of the progress.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. I think that the theory of change is very clear, right? You're mobilizing asset managers to apply the leverage, the influence that they have over the corporate space, over these multinational companies, to drive improved corporate water practices. Can you build that out into something a little bit more concrete? Maybe there's an example or two you can give of the work that Ceres does to actually facilitate that kind of interaction and how that actually feeds through into corporate water practices.
Yeah, definitely, because that's where the rubber hits the road, right? We want to see that impact on the ground. So a few examples. We launched the initiative back in August of 2020, and so Ceres has been providing water expertise and research and benchmarking to the institutional investors to support these conversations with companies and ensure that they're really focusing in and honing in on the right areas. So the investors are working with a framework called the 6 Corporate Expectations for Valuing Water, and these are a suite of expectations that really comprehensively cover water and really directly translate to climate resiliency. So these cover water availability, of course, water quality, ecosystem protection, board oversight, and also public policy engagement. So those are the framework that investors are working with companies. And so in a relatively short time, I would say we've already started to see some progress on the ground. So a couple quick examples. You all may be familiar with Domino's Pizza. This is the world's largest pizza restaurant chain in the world, and investors began engaging with these companies, having discussions on the 6 corporate expectations, as I mentioned. An investor put forward a shareholder resolution through the shareholder resolution process, and this was subsequently withdrawn because of a commitment from the pizza restaurant to move forward with a water risk assessment that included its entire supply chain. We saw a similar evolution for Hanes Celestial, also Chipotle Mexican Grill, which is one of the U.S.'s largest fast food chains. We saw a commitment where they moved forward with not only assessing the water risk, but also setting up a timeline for doing so and for acting on that risk. Just about a week or two ago, we also saw an investor signatory that put forward a shareholder resolution with McDonald's, really getting at how McDonald's can go about setting scientifically based goals for reducing their water risk. So some tangible examples, in a pretty short time, and we're really looking forward to having all the more so as time goes on.
So speaking of time, we are a little bit over, but last final quick fire question, if I may, Kirsten, where do we go from here?
Well, I think, we're encouraged by the progress that I just outlined, but we obviously need to ramp up efforts and do a lot more. Ceres just released a benchmark on the 72 companies that investors are focused on for this initiative. Encourage you all to take a look at that. I think the bottom line is there's some bright spots, but there's a lot of room where we need to work and need to go. So really look forward to having more investor engagements with the companies and making more progress around those 6 corporate expectations. And of course, we need more investors to join us and come into the tent, so to speak, for the Valley Water Finance Initiative. So definitely we'll be imploring others to join this effort as well.
Great. And that's a conversation to be continued, I think, after the session for those who'll be sticking around. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kirsten. I'm going to move ahead to our next debate segment. So, as we've heard from Kirsten, from Patricia, and from our keynotes earlier, one of the main entry points for engaging the financial sector on water issues is on risk. And so ultimately, many asset managers, investors, banks, insurers, credit rating agencies, and other mainstream financial actors who make up the global financial ecosystem are in the business of managing and pricing and acting upon risk as part of their core role. At the same time, as we will soon learn, the climate space has actually been moving towards this idea of resilience, and you've heard the term a lot this week, I'm sure. So there's a quite compelling argument to be made that we need to think carefully about how we frame risk and resilience, and perhaps even move away from this idea of risk in certain circumstances towards a new narrative around resilience. So here to make the case for resilience is John Matthews, Executive Director of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. He will be joined by some additional panelists as well, and we are going to get into a debate. So, John, I would like to welcome you up to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you. I appreciated the preparation for provocation that came from Joe. I'm going to start off with just like 2 kind of quick snapshots of this idea about risk maybe being a kind of a problem in how we are actually thinking about how we address climate impacts. A few years ago, I was at the Fiji, Germany COP in Bonn. I was in an official UNFCCC side event that was talking about adaptation finance. And there were maybe 40 people that were around a big U-shaped table. And the moderator was from the London School of Economics. He was moderating and essentially kind of going down each person and saying how much they were spending on adaptation. And he wasn't asking like, what the projects were. He was just asking how much. He was like totaling. It was kind of an accounting exercise, and it was it was a little self-satisfying. And he came to me. I was about 2/3 of the way through. I'd been invited to it for our work on water, and he assumed that I was going to be saying something about WASH and how much we've been spending in WASH, or maybe on the water sector more generally. And what I wanted to talk about was actually not the quantity of finance, but the quality of the finance. And the session is about the investment gap, right? And mostly when you hear it, especially in the climate world, you hear that as a gap in the amount that we're spending. But I tried to make the argument then, and I'm going to try to make the argument now with my colleague Mahim, that actually the way that we're spending the money is really important. And when I started to make that argument, I used an example of the Kariba Dam on the Zambezi River, which was a big World Bank hydropower. It's a massive dam. It's one of the world's largest. It's not that old, but during the dry season, maybe it generates 5% of its intended hydropower. Some days less. It's catastrophic for those economies. And it has become actually a kind of de-investment for that region, and that's the fear. So I started to use that example. He said, "We're not going to talk about that." He literally cut off my mic. He said, "We're just here to talk about how much we're spending." Now, if I were to go to the grocery store, and I were to come back and say to my wife, "Here's how much I spend on groceries," and maybe I didn't bring back very much, I didn't bring back the right food, that she would be very upset with me. How we spend the money really matters. So that's going to be the kind of essential item of the case. And the title is meant to be provocative, that I think climate is the new agenda, and it's a new agenda for water, and it's one that we really need to be able to embrace. And I'm going to use this contrast of de-risking versus resilience. So climate proofing is often the kind of the term of art that you hear in the investment community. It's especially for water, but more generally that there's a little extra step that's been added to a project development, and maybe we look at 3 or 4, if we're really lucky, 5 climate variables, kind of very narrowly defined, and try to see how the project's going to work. And it's been around for a long time, maybe 15 years. It's improved a little bit, but mostly it's kind of a fossil, I think. It's something that we've inherited and we're not doing that much with. And there are lots of good methodologies for it, but I think de-risking is insufficient. And the story I'll tell there is actually from a few days ago. There was a young professionals debate, and we were talking in that session about what is the level of the challenge that we had. And there was a point in which we could hear from the audience about their concerns. Do we know enough to confront the challenges that we're already experiencing, or do we need to know more? And there were 9 people who intervened, and 9 of those people said the things that we are doing now are nowhere near the challenges that we're actually facing. It was very impressive. It was very moving, actually, to hear these very personal stories. So de-risking, it's been around for a while, but it's not enough, in my opinion. And a good example here, this is from January of this year. California is a state. It's a rich state, right? If it was its own economy, maybe the 6th largest economy in the world, more or less 45 million people, and it's right now experiencing a 1,200-year drought, its worst drought in 1,200 years. At the same time, so you should think you should be just preparing for water scarcity. And for a 10-day period in last January, 35 million people were under a flood watch, extreme floods. So how do you prepare for both of those? That's the kind of climate challenge that we're facing even in the rich places. And that's the scope of the issue. So resilience, this is what we're starting to see with some of the development banks, what we're starting to see with some, I think, of the more progressive investment institutions, they're asking for a higher level. Sometimes this has been around for 4 or 5, even 6 years. They're saying resilience is what we need to be aiming for. It's a higher standard. It's about not managing 4 or 5 very specific climate risks, but managing for uncertain and potential risks. That kind of wide range of a challenge that we see in California. And resilience goes beyond just counting reliability and performance. It's not just continuity. It means sometimes we need to do things in a really different way, and it's going to take us a while to prepare for that. We need to be able to prepare for the extreme droughts and the extreme floods at the same time, and that's hard. It often is not just being robust, it means being flexible in these kind of contexts, and that's an extra step that we are not doing in most cases. And there are very few methodologies that exist for resilience. That's the new space. I'm going to give 2 quick examples. I'm not going to go into detail on them. You can learn more about them in both cases. The one on the left is called the Water Resilience Assessment Framework. This launched in 2021 with CEO Water Mandate, Pacific Institute, AGUA, my organization, WRI, and EME. And there's a specific guidance that has come out for corporates. There's another one that's about to come out for utilities. There's another one that's about to come out for RBOs that is trying to operationalize resilience for these broader audiences. The second one, I literally, in the back of the room this morning, I got the last case study. It happens to be from California, but there are lots of case studies from all over the world. There's Afghanistan, Veolia has one from Chile, and it's about at a higher level, not just thinking about an individual company, but thinking if you're a macroeconomist, you're a president or a prime minister, you're a finance minister, how do you manage your whole economy to be resilient? That's a really big issue. Maybe all your investment in clean energy is actually going to be competing with agriculture or with urban resilience. And how do we make those kinds of trade-offs? So this one, probably next week, is when it comes out, but you can see the cover. It's a cool cover. I wanted to put the cover up. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Maheen, from the Alliance for Water Stewardship. This is a joint AGUA-AWS session, and she's going to talk about how this plays out on another level.
Thank you, John, and I'm glad that I got up from that chair because it was really cold. So thank you very much, everybody. I think this has been a very insightful day today. We've kind of learned a lot about the climate, as well as how do we potentially combine these 2 very important spaces of climate and water. And obviously, what drives all of this is the money by the end of the day, and how do we actually utilize not just the quantity of money, but also the quality of money. So very briefly, let's keep this session a little engaging. Can we know from any raises of hands, how many times have we today or for the past couple of days heard about private sector inclusion? Have any of you heard about it? Yes. Have we also heard about collaboration and partnerships? Absolutely. So these are very, very necessary and something that I'm going to be talking about in water stewardship. So water stewardship, if I very quickly define, is the use of water that is socially and culturally equitable. It is economically beneficial, and it is also sustainable for your ecology. But by the end of the day, this is not something that can be done by one institution, by one corporate, by one MNC, by one public institution, by one NGO. It's something that has to be done collaboratively by these financing institutions, by these corporations, by the public departments as well. And yes, the idea of doing all of this is not something that can be done on your own, but it also has to be done not just at one particular level, but at a much larger landscape level. And that's what water stewardship is all about. So building resilience is actually very innate to the concept of water stewardship itself. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yes. Something which is also very core to this concept is continual improvement. We've been talking about de-risking a lot of these problems that we have, the challenges that we face, and the shared water challenges. But it's also very important to have this alignment of language between the water sector and the climate sector as well. So it's not just about de-risking, it is also about understanding how do we build resilience. And when we build resilience, it's a very forward-thinking concept, which means understanding that there are some repetitive challenges, but also understanding that there might be new and acute or chronic shocks to the system, which means you have to understand how do we go about building that sort of resilience in the system. So that's why I think the concept of now and kind of moving towards from de-risking to kind of moving towards resilience is also important, because we need to understand the importance of flexibility, as John had mentioned. If you could please move to the next slide. So it's very important that the core concept, besides having to have that collaborative and those site and landscape approaches, is the idea of constantly improving. Because constantly improvement would mean that your challenges could be different in the future, and you have to adapt accordingly. So one thing is, how do we scale impact? How do we have that impact? And while we've been talking a lot about partnerships and a lot about collaboration, it's very important that we are putting all the assets in the right direction as well, using the right quality, but also the right quantity. And I think that is something which is very coherent, is that there is a unanimous agreement amongst stakeholders for the need of greater collaboration, because the idea is, how would this collaboration actually get the right finances, the confidence to actually have that financial flows in this particular system. So why we are talking about partnerships and collaborations, it is also important why are we doing this work, so that we can drive that kind of confidence between the financiers, between the public sector, because by the end of the day, while the private sector has the capability, the financial capability and the technical capability to do something and adopt water stewardship, I think the influencers, which is the public departments, the public institutions, the finances, they are the one who can create the motivation for this scaling up of water stewardship, so that this particular action is actually done on the ground and can be done at a much larger scale, so that we actually create some amount of impact. Can we move to the last slide, please? I'm trying to keep it short, simple, hopefully sweet. So moving from this very end of slide is from risk moving to resilience. The reason for this is actually also to have this alignment of language between the two sectors. Considering water has now in this mix of climate, and I think the importance of it is now being understood quite a bit. So it's so much better than I think the previous years. But I think it's also very important so that there's coherence between the two spaces, and then there's also coherence between these different departments, the private sector, the public sector, the financials. So it's very important that we keep that linkages very much open, and we move towards something which can be understood in the same language, instead of each of them having their own jargons, their own understandability. And hopefully, by next year, we can together be more resilient and maybe less risk-averse. Thank you very much.
Questions for John and Maïn? Geoffrey, you have a question? Yes, the moving mic.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations that were really clear, brilliant. I just wanted to ask about the metrics for resilience and water resilience. And we often talk about water footprint, but somehow the concept of water footprint, what we imagine straight away is really a quantitative concept, cubic meters. But water footprint should be also imagined as a qualitative footprint and qualitative concept. So I wanted to ask you about that. And is this somehow something that, some people have in mind somewhere, and especially people working on resilience and water resilience? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. As far as water stewardship is concerned, I 100% agree. We tend to very narrow it down to water quantities and the water footprinting, but I think it's very important. We tend to look at water very holistically. So we talk about quality, and we talk about important water-related areas. We talk about WASH, but we also talk about governance that we've been talking all day. So what the matrix actually has been developed under the water stewardship is actually the framework that has been developed, which is the Alliance for Water Stewardship International Standard. So if you can go and Google it, and you can easily find that that's the kind of matrix that's going to ask you the right questions that will lead you in that direction from, risk aversing to kind of developing that resilience through those adaptation measures. It's not prescriptive, because by the end of the day, we've been talking a lot about how water is local and how the hydrological cycle is also a common good. But by understanding that your solutions can be different, so by not being prescriptive, which means that you as an organization, or for instance, by collaborating with others as well, you can actually derive your own solutions.
I'm going to use the example of Singapore. Singapore in 1945, after the end of World War II, was probably one of the very poorest countries in the world, and it's one of the richest now. And it's not because they had a lot of water. They weren't managing for a basin, right? It's an island. It's a tiny island, actually. They had to think about water as central to their economy, to their public health system, to their energy system, to manufacturing, to trade, and so on. But they had to think about it really broadly. And they were using the concept of resilience without using the word resilience. So where does their water come from now? It comes from the Malay Peninsula. It comes from the ocean. It comes from rainwater harvesting. It comes from water reuse. They are managing so far beyond basins. What I would say is we all need to be Singapore. And the global goal and adaptation negotiations that are going on literally as we speak. We're waiting on text on it. Water shows up 3 times in it, which is very impressive. And the reason and the importance of that is that we need to be able. The global goal in adaptation is not really about adaptation finance. It should result in more adaptation finance, but what it should really tell us is if we're doing a good job with adaptation. And then there should be specific measures. And if we're doing a good job with adaptation, then the finance should follow. And that goes back to my original point about the investment gap, the very well-named topic of this session, that we need good projects, we need good thinking, we need real resilience.
Thank you, John. And on that note, thank you both for a very interesting segment. Thank you. So, provocative, as promised, but also very constructive and practical. And in the spirit of being constructive and practical and tangible, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our final debate segment on the water carbon nexus, which will be facilitated by Sweeny Binsari. Sweeny is Climate Change and Natural Resources Manager at Solidaridad. Sweeny, you've been very patient. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that introduction. And I think in the interest of time, we are already well over time, I'll try to make this as short as possible. And as Joe has tried to explain, we've been talking a lot about metrics and statistics and all this. So I'm just trying to boil it down to what are we doing? What are the practical solutions on the ground? And how does this fit to all the others, what the other speakers have been speaking about moving forward? So I'll introduce, Joe's already introduced me. I work for Solidaridad Network. Solidaridad is an international civil society organization. We work with partners to develop solutions for smallholder farming. And already that tells you why and what the agenda for this presentation is about. We want to discuss how we're leveraging, we are actually discussing how we're leveraging financing to help with water adaptation and related aspects. And so what we are doing at Solidaridad potentially is linked to this, because for all the speakers who've come before me, one of the things that you've consistently heard is that, yes, there is money. We still don't know where that money is. But the question is, now that there is money, one of the key things that has been brought about, is it enough? And one of the things that is consistently coming out during this conference is that money is not enough. Yeah. So one way or another, people need to adapt. So how then do we do this? So instead of sitting back and waiting for these climate global talks to take shape and these formal talks to actually guide us in the right direction, what are we doing at a practical levels? Because when you're talking about water, agriculture, finance, all these things are in one way or another linked. So what are we doing to try and help smallholder farmers already adopt, even as we wait for everything else to align itself? So in this aspect, I'm going to be talking about how we are leveraging carbon credits to drive sustainable water solutions. And I know there's already a lot of debate going around carbon credits, but I'll tell you in our context, because this is what's working and what we are seeing as our farmers are leveraging on important ways to do this. So we already know that climate crisis has been referred as the water crisis, yeah? And in the African context, this means we're dealing with extremes. One day it's flooding, the other day is scarcity. How then do you prepare this farmer in terms of onset of rains and in terms of scarcity on the one hand? And there's just a lot of play around there. And this is where the governance issue that Patricia had spoken about earlier on comes on board. So one of the first steps for us is to identify the needs and the risks. Like it has been said before, you can't go into this financing space without knowing what are the needs and what are the risks you're even dealing with. So where are you channeling the money in the first place? So what we are doing as Solidaridad is identifying these risks and needs, and we do something we call the climate vulnerability assessments. There are already so many tools in the platform, but we have customized ours based on our 50-year journey working with smallholder farmers. And what this tool then draws out is, when you're talking about flooding, which areas are potentially flooding, which areas are we looking in terms of scarcity when it comes to water, and how do we fit in what kind of technologies then are important for this, rather than giving a blanket solution and saying irrigation works for everyone. It won't work, for example, when it comes to flooding. It's a different technology that is needed there. So then these assessments help us to narrow down what are the specific technology needs and access that come with these things. So the assessments then will let us know exactly if there's financing that is coming through, where is it channeled, which technology is most applicable to our smallholder farmers. So once we carry out the climate vulnerability assessment, because they will tell us the barriers, including what I've talked about, the climate extremes that come with flooding and security, but they will also draw out issues on technology. Access, is it access? Is access the issue, or is it just availability? Or what exactly is going on? What is making this smallholder farmer not adapt well? So then that will draw out and tell us, okay, then it's not really the technology exists even locally, but for this farmer to access it, you need to do 1, 2, or 3 things. So these are some of the barriers that come out very, very strongly in our climate vulnerability assessments. And of course, now the issue of finance always comes in. Where is the money to invest in that particular technology, and then the actual needs and risks that have been identified so far? So once we are clear on these risks and the needs that are needed, now looking for this financing is what has been a very, very key barrier. And one way we have realized that is potentially working for us is using the carbon credit revenues to sort of unlock some of this financing. How do we do this? So about 3 or 4 years ago, we started with a business case in one of our operational countries, 2 of our operational countries in Uganda and Tanzania. And the questions we were asking ourselves, so our farmers have the potential to gain carbon credits from agroforestry practices. The messaging then was, we are not saying carbon credit revenue is the solution, is what is going to get you out of poverty. No, what we are saying is that this is an incentive to already the good work you have been doing, whether it's agroforestry or related aspects that relate to soil health when it comes to biochar. But how then do we use the revenues that are accrued from such initiatives to actually help where to divert the money where it's needed most. So once we established a business case, and it looked like a good business case when it comes to incentives and bringing incomes to the farmers. So the next step was that how then do we advise our farmers to sort of channel this financing to help with technology access. So for example, we had farmers who essentially are already facing a lot of water scarcity issues when it comes to dry spells. And then the issue was accessing technologies related to irrigation techniques, yeah? Because this, in terms of affordability for a small-scale holder farmer who in Africa, essentially some of the countries you're working with, is a farmer who owns about 1 to 2 hectares of land. That's significantly small, and this is not only on production. It's equivalent, the land is used for a lot of other purposes. So essentially, when you narrow it down, it's even smaller than you're thinking about. So how much income really can come out from such a small piece of land? So we were looking at this carbon credit initiative as one way in which our farmers can earn revenue and divert that revenue to things like the technology equipment that they need to sort of move forward with their adaptation practices. So we are looking at our farmer who before could not access irrigation equipment, but now using the small incentive that's coming from the agroforestry practices that are attracted some sort of carbon revenue, is able now to be linked to the relevant suppliers and microfinance institutions that can support him or her sort of buy this equipment and then develop this further. So this is how we have seen some of these solutions, and rather leveraging some of this little financing that is coming through to try and push the agenda forward when it comes to adaptation. And this will not only be limited, for example, to water, it will be limited to all these other barriers that have been preventing the farmer from sort of reaching the optimal production benefits that we want to see when it comes to yield and the particular commodity that this farmer is growing. So we thought that we think that this is one of the ways in which we can continuously employ, now that we have established a business case that works within the carbon credit space, that this is something we can try and use in respect to other technologies other than irrigation that can help even when it comes to flooding. You're talking about early warning systems and related equipment to sort of help these farmers be more resilient moving forward. And this is just to say that we are already acknowledging that carbon credits doesn't necessarily shift the economics economics metrics we've been talking about earlier on, but it's the small drop of ocean, the small drop of water that we feel we are contributing to the bigger ocean moving forward to ensure that this smallholder farmer is actually able to benefit a bit more from related aspects of financing that are coming through to him. And so for us, we have seen some of these solutions work even as we wait for the government to try and make traction, and we wait for these water subsidies we've been talking about from Morning and these other related financings that have been presented, for example, in the pyramid sources to help us advance this further. So I'll just stop right there. I know Joe is looking at me and wondering, yeah. Yes. But then if there are any questions from the floor related to this, I'll be happy to answer. But that's in brief what we are doing to try and leverage financing when it comes to water adaptation issues, particularly in the smallholder farmer context. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sweeney. Just before we wrap up, are there any questions on Sweeney's presentation? Nothing burning. Okay. Yes, Patricia, you have a question. Let me get you the mic.
I just have a comment. I think Geoffrey asked about the water footprints, and we actually had an announcement from the Minister Mitchell from the UK government, and he essentially indicated to us that there is 39 million for investment on water security, for the water security strategy going forward. And that includes work on the fair water footprints, on the resilience water accelerator, as well as the water tracker. So you'll be finding more about that over the next few days and few weeks. And so it's a significant investment from the UK government. They're committing for these initiatives, and particularly for the fair water footprint. If I may mention very quickly that for the UK, we have 70% of the water comes from external sources. So that's quite significant. And if we can look into addressing that in our supply chains, that will be quite significant. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. Yes, there's a question here, sir.
This question goes to you. Good morning, moderator. My name is John Opiti. I'm from the South Sudan. Actually, I would like also to give my thanks to Patricia for this liberative presentation that she has given. Although I will not go long, but mine is going to be a direct question because you talk by year 2030, water is going to be reduced by 50%. So I would like to know what is the reasons or what the directions about. Thank you.
Sure. I think you may be referring to the slide on the water footprint loan from BBA, and where Iberdrola it's got the target of reducing the water consumption by 2030. I think that's 50%. So you might be referring to that, but essentially that's a mechanism, an incentivization mechanism that the bank is using so that this company looks into their water consumptions, particularly since they are within the in a sector for the net zero ambition. So it's quite critical, and as you saw from water risks, it's affecting everywhere. So they're essentially using the CDP water data to see their progress, and the CDP has got there's a water score, and it goes from fail all the way to A. And if these companies are progressing towards best practice, they get an A. And for these financial institutions, BBVA, if they're seeing progress on the CDP water score, then they can see that they're making progress. So perhaps I think that's the one that I mentioned for 2030. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I hope that helps to clarify. We can also pick up the conversation afterwards. We are a little bit over time, but that's because we've had a whole lot of speakers addressing many different aspects to this water, climate and finance intersection. So I think it's inevitable that the discussions have gone on a little bit longer than planned, but I hope that's okay. I did want to just say thank you, Sweeney, for bringing some specificity and solutions emphasis to this, and the point that you made on not waiting for politics to solve this. This is not something that we have the luxury of waiting for. And so the work that Solidaridad that you're doing, that you're leading, I think is a really essential part of the solution. So thank you for bringing that in. Thanks to all of our speakers, our panelists, partners. This has been a joint effort between what feels like dozens of organizations, and I think we've done our best to put it all together and have a constructive conversation. Big thanks to the AV team at the back, who have kept us running all the way through this. So thank you. Go and have some lunch. Come back for more sessions on transformative climate finance this afternoon, and we will leave it there. Enjoy the rest of COP. Thank you.